Hi again guys, and welcome to episode 41 of GT Masters, the review series for Gran Turismo's selection of primarily GT class race cars and various other vehicles which fit under that same loose category. And in this particular pick we're featuring the final of our Ford GT based race cars that are currently featured on the game. We've of course featured the LM in Gulf colours, the Spec 2, which was the hero car of Gran Turismo 4, and now we're featuring the newest model of the three, which is ironically pitched as being the oldest of the three, because this is the Ford GT LM test car, the prototype, if you will, for the other two. But of course this is a newer car, even though it's technically the original. This is a full premium, unlike the other two, and its spec is actually not the same as the Spec 2 vehicle, which you would be forgiven for assuming it would be. You would probably assume, as I did originally, that this is basically just a carbon fibre version of that car, with a premium interior and a different colour. Kind of like the Audi R18 test version in the bare carbon. It's actually not. The specs are almost completely different across the board. The power is different, the torque is different, the weight, the horsepower per tonne, even the PP is different. Now this car costs 1.8 million credits, which is a lot for a GT class machine. There's no way to cut that without saying it as it is. That is a lot. You can get an LMP for that money. So the question is, like the other two Ford GTs, is it worth that? Or are you better off getting one of the other two? Well, you get the 5.4 litre supercharged V8 that you'd expect in the Ford GT. It produces 1 brake horsepower more than the Spec 2 version, the white car, 939 horsepower, and also, interestingly, significantly more torque. 884 foot-pounds, which is one of the highest torque figures of this entire series. As far as the weight though, it weighs about 35 kilos more, and 1165 kilos, and consequently it produces less horsepower per tonne. It's still a lot though, at 806, and most notably, and this is possibly in my opinion the best thing about this car, is the PP is lower. I mentioned in the episode covering the Spec 2 LM that the PP is really far too high. This car puts the PP in a much more realistic level. I would say it's perhaps still a little bit too high, but at least it's better. 685 PP compared to over 690 on the other one seems like a relatively small difference. But that's actually a big difference given how similar the specs are. This has more power and more torque, and yet the PP is lower. Now you do have that extra bit of weight, but adding 35 kilos does not drop the PP of the other car that much. So this is actually, on paper at least, a superior vehicle in more ways. So the question is, does that on-paper spec translate to the road? Because obviously having a good spec isn't necessarily a guarantee that it will be a good car. Well, it translates in terms of straight line performance in pretty much an identical way to the Spec 2 vehicle. The top speed is roughly the same, around 250 with low downforce. The acceleration is also very similar, and even the handling actually isn't that far off. However, I would say that this car is possibly not as good in terms of handling as the Spec 2. It's a little bit better perhaps than some of the other GT cars in general, but compared to in fact both of the other GT race cars, I would say it's not quite as good. I personally would say that the best handling of the three is the Gulf liveried car, but traditionally people would probably say, I think the opinion would be more inclined toward the Spec 2 vehicle having better handling. And that's understandable. And it kind of does. It's more focused, it feels a little bit more like an LMP in terms of its handling. It's a little bit more twitchy, more focused, but I prefer the slightly duller steering of the LM, which is why I would give it the edge in terms of handling. This car, unfortunately, handles as you'd expect it to. The other two models are technically better than they should be in terms of handling. This car's more realistic, so in this car it's much easier to get the tail out, unintentionally to spin up the wheels, and the handling in general is just a little bit more twitchy than the other two. In my opinion, of course. I'm sure there are people who like this more than the other two. As far as the look of the car, that's really where I can understand why people would like it. Because although it is carbon, which is, in my opinion, a bit boring compared to a full livery, it is fully detailed, and that does make a massive difference. It's a much better looking car in terms of quality, and it has that fully detailed interior, which for a lot of people will seal the deal. In terms of performance, as I said, in a straight line they pretty much break even. There's no significant advantage either way. For handling though, I'd actually recommend the Spec 2 or the Gulf liveried LM instead of this car. So I would say overall, is this car worth buying? To the right person, yes. If you're specifically interested in this car, and you don't really care what it's like, you just want it, then you will be pleased with it, because it is a good car. However, if you're purely looking for the best version of the Ford GT race car, then you'd be better off going for one of the other two, in my opinion at least. And another interesting thing to note about this car is that unlike the other two, you don't buy it in the Ford dealership. So don't go to the Ford dealership looking for it, because you won't find it. It's found in the Japanese section underneath the Gran Turismo dealership. So overall, it's certainly not a bad car. It's very good, in fact. But the other two are so good that it struggles to live up to them in terms of pure handling and drivability. But that's it for this particular episode. I'll see you guys next time, and as always, thanks for watching.